I'm Professor Tina Good, and this mini video is going to be discussing judges and particularly focusing on not only the men in the judges book of the Bible, but also we're going to be considering the women and whether or not they are scarlet women. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to show you a PowerPoint that I've developed for this video. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to give you just a little bit of context leading up to Judges, or what we call the histories, okay, of which the book of Judges is just one book within the histories, okay? But we are coming out of the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and you'll remember from Exodus where the Israelites, after 400 years of enslavement, according to the story of Exodus, escape through the leadership of Moses. And their destination is the promised land promised to Abraham in previous chapters. Okay, as you recall, the Torah, or the first 5 books of Moses, is also called the law. We talked about the 10 commandments. What I didn't have you read is Leviticus, which goes over a lot more laws and rules to live by for the Israelite people. And also we did not read a Deuteronomy, which configures a particular kind of historical narrative through a particular philosophy, which I'm going to be talking about in just a moment. Okay, so moving on, we recall that we are in a tribal government, right? That means we do not have a centralized government. There is no king. Okay, yes, Moses was in the Torah a centralized leader for sure. And when they get to the promised land, Moses is not allowed to enter. Joshua kind of takes his place, but that is not to be confused with a king. Okay, they have broken down into 12 tribes. The Israelites are in 12 tribes, known as the 12 tribes of Jacob, named after the different sons of Jacob. They are still a nomadic people, as we see, as they're roaming for 40 years to get to the promised land. They are not an agrarian people. They have, you know, animals that they shepherd instead of crops that they raise. And so at this time, as we look at these earlier books of the Old Testament, we are looking at a nation building narrative, okay? Because let's face it, they don't have a centralized king. They don't have a centralized government. They don't even have a land, right, that is uniting them. There are no boundaries. And so the only thing that's really uniting the people is the centralized God, right? The Yahweh, as we are referring to him, as the Israelites referred to him. And so this is really important, because if they were to start, worshiping, as we talked about with the 10 Commandments, if they were to start worshiping the Canaanite gods, or, the household gods, this would threaten the unity and the power, right, of these people as they get into the promised land. Because of course, the problem when they get to the promised land of Canaan, there were already people there. Okay, so a little note about the Deuteronomistic histories. This is, it's a little debated on whether or not if this was a single writer writing for somebody we're going to talk about later named Josiah, or if it was a group of writers. But the point of the Deuteronomistic historians was that they wrote through and rearranged histories to support this particular philosophy. And that is that as long as the Israelites worshiped Yahweh alone and faithfully kept the laws of the Torah, that they would win all their battles and they would prosper economically. If they are their leaders, mix the worship of Yahweh with Canaanite gods, household gods, that they will then suffer military defeat, financial ruin, and eventual enslavement by foreign enemies. All right, so this, goes to explain a lot of things that happen to the Israelites between, the Exodus um, and the eventual Babylonian exile, which we'll talk about in later weeks, right? The later writers, the Deuteronomistic writers, sort of bumped up against something, and that was uh, bad things were happening to the chosen people. And so, why was that happening? And so to explain that, there was this philosophy that said, well, clearly it was because the Israelites were behaving badly, and that's when bad things happened to them. But when they, did what they were supposed to do, then good things happened to them. Okay. All right. So this we can see, that Deuteronomistic thread, even in the Torah, but we really begin to see that in these books that we call the histories, right? And so these histories, as histories are, generally is like this narrative of the history of the Israelites once they get to right, the promised land. Um, Dealing with the people that are already there, either through conquest or finding a way to coexist with them, and even sometimes being conquered by them. And also, we see them developing from a nomadic system to an agrarian system, right? We are now into the Iron Age, and we see their, civilization beginning to develop just a little bit more. I didn't have you read Joshua. Joshua is a very sort of gruesome tale of when Joshua leads the Israelites to conquer the people that are living in Canaan. It is not really, considered necessarily historically accurate, but it does now shift us, a little bit away from the mythology of the Torah into more of legendary figures. And Joshua becomes, not that Moses is not legendary, but he's almost mythological in his communication with God. Joshua has a little more distance between God than Moses did. Um, but he still has a lot of, you know, uh, benefits from his relationship with God. And most of us have heard at least of the story of Jericho, where the walls come tumbling down. If you know nothing else, you might know that song. And the idea is that rather than conquering through war, they simply carry the Ark of the Covenant around the wall several times as prescribed by God, and the walls come tumbling down. And then the Israelites go in and massacre all of those that live there, which would, you know, be a problem for 21st century sensibilities, 20th century sensibilities, for sure. But it was a common story told at that time. Um, and the idea was to replace, right, the people who were not worshiping the right God with the people that are to show the power, right, of their God. What's important here for our purposes, though, is to take a look at the character known as Rahab. All right, and I didn't have you read this story, but I do want to give you a little background about Rahab. So Rahab was a prostitute whose brothel was outside the city walls of Jericho, or perhaps maybe like even on the wall, but right there outside the walls. And when Joshua sends his spies in, before he knows that they're going to tumble down the wall through circling it, he sends his spies in to figure out how best to conquer Jericho. And Rahab, hides the spies, right? So, first of all, we know that she's a prostitute. We know that she's a Canaanite. Um, and when the spies come, and, we can imagine why the spies are at the brothel, she hides them when the Canaanites come to find them, and she negotiates uh, with Joshua um, about what will happen when the Israelites go and conquer Jericho. And her number one goal is to save herself and to save her family. And so she says, "I will not tell the people of Jericho about your pending invasion, if you promise to protect me and my family." Okay. And Joshua agrees. And so when they invade, or when the walls come down and they go and they massacre everyone, Rahab and her family are spared. And you'll see from the verse that I presented here that she continues to live among the Israelites for the rest of her life. So we ask the question, is Rahab a scarlet woman? Well, surely, in her role as prostitute, we might think that she is a scarlet woman. She certainly fulfills the role of sexual promiscuity. But as we are developing our concept of what it means to be a scarlet woman, we have to go beyond the sexual promiscuity and go, what else defines a scarlet woman, right? And certainly this idea of betraying one's people, betraying one's husband, would also cause one to be a scarlet woman. A woman who gets out of her place, sort of rebels against the authority of men, might be considered a scarlet woman, right? And so that takes us kind of back a little bit to Eve, right? A scarlet woman, but didn't really wasn't sexual promiscuous or didn't betray Adam, really. And so we have to kind of complicate our definition of what it means to be a scarlet woman. Now, Rahab does appear to be a scarlet woman, not only in her, promiscuity, but she also does, appear to betray her own people in order to protect herself and her family. And yet, in Joshua, she is not portrayed as um, a scarlet woman. And one thing we need to do is complicate our idea of what it means to be a prostitute, right? Okay, because let's face it, at that time, prostitute was just it was just a job that women could do, right? Women didn't have a lot of career options, right? Um, um, they were, either um, a mother. They could be a midwife. That was not without danger. Or they could be a prostitute, right? So this is sort of how women, could make a living. And so it didn't really carry all of the, negative connotation that it might carry today. And so that alone might not make someone a scarlet woman. But she does betray her people, right? She does seem to be self-interested, and yet the Bible doesn't portray her in an unfavorable light, right? So we think about like why? Well, some might argue that while she betrays her own people, she does not betray the Israelites, and she does, you know, go to them because she does believe their God is the superior God, right? And so, whether or not we think she is a Scarlet Woman, I think is worth exploration. But the book of Joshua does not cast her in that light, say that like it does with Eve, um, or some of the women that we're going to talk about later on. Okay. So I wanted to set that up for you so that you had, a way of comparing the women that we're going to talk about in Judges. Okay. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about what is a judge. Okay. So in the Torah, the first five books of Moses, um, it was clear that Moses could not settle all of the disputes, um, of all the people. Not even with the help of his brother Aaron could this be done. And so they set up a system where there is a judge system for each tribe, okay? That, mostly is working towards settling civil disputes, okay? Who stole my sheep? What's the penalty for stealing the sheep? Those kinds of things, right? But by the histories, right? We have a different kind of judge system. Yes, there's still some of that going on. But now what we see now that they're in Canaan and now that Canaan is, occupied by other people, what we begin to see is this shift and a judge, although there are still 12 judges, we are not yet in a centralized government, right? That does not come until later. Um, there's one per tribe, and generally they are described as charismatic men and women who rally the Israelites from various tribes to go out and fight against or conquer or escape, right, the subordination of the Canaanite regions. Okay, so this idea of being a judge for judging, disputes, while that might be still a minor part of it, it's really more about military leadership. Okay. And so, what we see before we get to Deborah, one of our first judges that's described in the book of Judges, is this verse right at the beginning of Judges 4, where it says, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, right? We see the Deuteronomistic history there. So the Lord sold them into the land of King Jamin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazar. The commander of his army was Sisera. Okay. So at this time, the story that's being told is the story of Deborah, right? An interesting moment because, right, most of the judges that we read about are men, and Deborah is an obvious exception, right? In that she is a woman and she is a married woman, right? So, we have to wonder, like, why isn't her husband the judge, right? Well, Deborah is probably a judge in the story because she is a prophetess, right? She is able to communicate, with God. And through that communication, through her ability to prophesize because of that communication, she gets the rank of judge. And while she does, settle um, some of the disputes among people, right? It is really more her charismatic leadership that gives her judge status. And while she is not leading troops in, she leaves that to, Barak to go and conquer Sisera. It's interesting that she has to persuade Barak. She has to persuade Barak what to do, go gather troops from the various tribes, right? Um, go carry the Ark of the Covenant. And he goes, okay, I'll go, but I won't go without you. Okay. And so Deborah says, all right, I'll go with you, but understand glory will not be yours. Okay. The glory will go to a woman. All right. So, when we look at Deborah, we'll look at her like, okay, is she a scarlet woman? Well, is she sexually promiscuous? It doesn't appear that she is, right? She doesn't seem, there's no stories about her sleeping around. She has a direct communication with God. She seems loyal to her husband. She does not betray her husband, and she does not betray her people. Is she, does she know her place? It seems that maybe she does, right? Even though she is a woman who is theoretically in a man's role, she is only ruling through what God tells her to do, right? If we are to, believe the story as it is written, right? Now, if we were to take a step back and go like, well, I'm not sure I'm going to believe this Deuteronomistic narrator, and we take a step back, right? What we see is perhaps we do have a woman who's stepping out of her place, right? Who is this woman to be this leader, right? And probably those of you who've read The Red Tent are hearkening back to the character of Rebecca, right? So maybe, right? It all depends on how you interpret this character, not necessarily by the tyranny of the text, by the narrator who's telling this story, right? But taking a step back and looking at her objectively, okay? Nevertheless, she doesn't appear, right, to be, a woman who is necessarily, leading the Israelites down the wrong path. All right. So, as I mentioned before, Deborah had said to, Barak, you will not receive the glory of the victory. Yes, there will be victory. Yes, I will go with you, but you will not receive the victory. And in fact, who does receive the victory is a character named Jal, right? Who is not an Israelite woman. In fact, she is married to Heber, who is an ally of King Jabin, somebody that's who they're fighting, right? That's who has conquered them. And so that's who they're fighting. She is an ally. Her husband is not there. And Sisera, the general of King Jabin, um, flees the battle, right? Some cowardice there, and goes to Jal's tent. All right. And Jal takes him in. Now, why would he go to Zhao's tent? Clearly, he felt it was a safe place. This is an ally, right? But we also have to take a look at Zhao's vulnerability here, right? Here is this general and his troops, and her husband is not there. What are her choices here? Okay. But she does allow him in. And in so doing, there are hospitality rules that kick in. That means that, she is supposed to protect Jah, right? You'll remember from Sodom and Gomorrah, the Lot is supposed to protect the angels and offers up his daughters to the men who are storming his front door to get the angels, and the same thing is true here. Um, and then there's this interesting moment where Sisera says, can I have some water? And she's like, here's some milk. And there's a lot of interpretation about, what's going on with that milk. Does she give him milk so that she can, you know, um, put some sort of sedative in there so that he'll sleep more soundly? Is it really breast milk and she's seducing him? Is there like a sexual act that happens there? There's all kinds of interpretations there. But what we actually see is that Sisera does fall asleep and Jal kills him by driving, right, a tent peg through his head. Now, we have to really remember this is a tent that these are big tents. This is not the tents that we go camping with now, right? And the tent pegs would have been very large, right? And so, to have the kind of force that the story, for the story to be accurate would be really, super amazing. And so she kills Sisera. And the glory then goes to Jal rather than Barak, which would have been a big slap, right? That, you know, it's a woman, that takes down Sisera rather than Barak, right? So this is a big moment, and you'll see that a whole chapter in Judges, the whole chapter Judges 5, is a song that is celebrating Deborah and Jael's actions, right? So I have to think, like, is Jael a Scarlet Woman? I mean, she is certainly not portrayed that way in Judges, because she has a whole song, and she gets the glory for this battle rather than Barak, right? But if we take a step back, and it's like, well, maybe or maybe not did she seduce Barak? I mean, sorry, Sisera, but she does allow him into the tent, right? And maybe she shouldn't have done that in the first place. Um, does she betray her people? Well, it seems that maybe she does, right? I mean, maybe not directly, but they are allies. They do have a peace accord between them, right? And she kills him. And so, there does seem to be a betrayal of her husband. There does seem to be a betrayal of her people. And yet she is not portrayed that way, right? She is portrayed as a great hero of the Israelites, right? And again, so we have to step back and go like, okay, so who gets to be determined as a Scarlet Woman and who does not, according to the Deuteronomistic histories, right? And maybe it's a little bit more complicated than, who betrays their people, but which people are betrayed, which husbands are betrayed, right? Who is being sexually promiscuous, right? But what we do know is that, much like today, right? Perhaps the number one insult that can be flung at a woman, right, is sexual promiscuity, whether or not that promiscuity actually exists. All right. So now we move ahead quite a bit in Judges. And, there are several Judges stories in between Deborah and Samson. But we come to Samson, and this is probably one of the more famous stories of Samson and Delilah. But there's quite a bit of Samson before we even get to Delilah, right? So Samson is also becomes a judge, but he has a little bit of backstory, and that is that his mother, who has no name, is barren. We've seen this over and over again. An angel of God comes to her and says, okay, don't eat anything bad, don't drink anything bad, and you will have a son. All right. And so we have to look at Samson's mother, right? Just because she's a woman, is she a Scarlet Woman, right? Is she sexually promiscuous? Does she get out of her place? Does she betray her husband? Does she betray her people? It seems like, probably not. Um, you can look and see how you might interpret that differently if you'd like. But she finally, does have a child, and he is supposed to be a Nazarite, which means, he doesn't cut his hair, he doesn't drink, he doesn't eat unclean food, right? He's supposed to be, this sort of um, ascetic type of guy, right? Which, of course, Samson, is not. In fact, um, he does seem to have a thing for Philistine women. Okay, Samson, while now in the histories, instead of being more mythical, we are more in the land of legend and legendary, like Joshua. And I think we can, give that to Samson as well. But Samson is sort of also, harking on, a very similar story of Hercules, right? That superhuman strength, that, sort of, you know, God kind of causing the pregnancy of a woman. Yes, Hercules may have been a demigod. It doesn't, the Old Testament certainly doesn't go that far, but his strength does come from God, as long as he follows the rules, right? Um, And it does seem that, he's able to get away with breaking quite a few of those rules. Um, you know, maybe except for one. So again, he has a thing for the Philistine women. He goes down, he sees this woman. Again, no name is given to this woman, it's just Samson's wife. Um, and he's a little bit of a jokester. He had killed a lion before, and when he goes back and sees the carcass of the lion, there's like a beehive in there. So he tells the family of the woman, answer this riddle. Let's make a bet. You answer this riddle, and if you do, then I'll give you, 30 coats of armor. But if you do, you have to give me that, right? And you have 7 days to answer the riddle, and they can't do it. They can't figure it out. They can't figure it out. And so, they go to Samson's wife, and they're like, you have to find out what the answer of the riddle is. We can't afford to give him all of this armor. So she goes to him. He tells her the answer. She tells her people, right? Is she a Scarlet Woman, right? Who is she betraying? Is she betraying her husband? Is she betraying her people? What are her choices here, right? Can she even escape being called a Scarlet Woman, being put in that situation? Okay. Everything goes badly after that, as you'll know when you read the text. And eventually, her own people kill her because of Samson's actions. Um, Later on, again, as a thing for the Philistine women, it's a non-Canaanite tribe that lives in Canaan, very, very powerful tribe. Um, uh, Also not Israelite, obviously. And he goes down and he sees a prostitute. He lays with her, and the Philistines, wait, for him to come out so they can capture him. And he tricks them once again. And, you see about um, him carrying, these walls to escape them. And so we see yet another moment of his superhuman strength. Then he meets Delilah of Sorek, and it's sort of unclear. Most of the time she goes down as a Philistine woman, or at least an ally of the Philistines. It's unclear as to whether or not she is a Philistine or an Israelite. But generally it's interpreted that she's, you know, in the Philistines, right? It's important to understand that we're not sure of that when we're thinking about whether how much of a scarlet, if at all, woman she is, right? Samson just becomes infatuated by her, right? And he just can't get enough of Delilah, right? The Philistines see this and they offer her 1,100 pieces of silver to betray Samson, right? And we're gonna see that again, that idea of this offering of 11 or 1,100, or something to do with 11 pieces of silver in order to pay for betrayal, right? And what they want is they want to find the root of Samson's strength, right? And she eventually does find out. It's not because Samson is any too wise about this, as you will read in the story, uh, but she does betray him, and he is subsequently captured. And she does this by cutting off his hair, which is the source of his strength. They come in, they capture him, they torture him, and finally, you know, his hair begins to grow back. We don't know what happens to Delilah after that, but Samson is able to take revenge on those who captured him, right? And in so doing, right, kills many of the Philistines, who are, of course, an enemy of the Israelites, right? Which is what he's supposed to do, sort of, as a judge. But you'll notice that he's not acting as a military leader, right? He's kind of just acting on his own. He has the strength to do it. And he really doesn't have any interest in killing the Philistines until they capture him. He just wants to sleep with their women, right? And so, we look at Deborah, right, in the beginning of Judges, and that kind of model of a text, and we look at Sam of a judge, and we look at Samson, right, as, okay, what's happened to the culture that now we have this guy as a judge, but also take a look at Delilah, right? Now, she goes down as Scarlet Woman of Scarlet Women, right? And she's like the definition, right? Because she betrays Samson. But again, what were her choices, right? If Samson comes in and claims Delilah, what are her choices, right? As a woman, as an unmarried woman in this society, we don't know if she's a prostitute or not, but what are her choices? Um, and then when these powerful men come in and offer her this silver, that's where she gets into trouble because she accepts the silver. That's kind of why she gets, you know, marked as um, a Scarlet Woman. But if we go back to Rahab, the negotiation still happens. Like, I won't betray you if you save my family, right? So how is this different? Well, you might notice immediately, well, because she's not um she is not supporting the Israelites, right? She is betraying the Israelites. She is betraying Samson, right? Rather than betraying her own people. Okay. And so she, just gets skewered in the story as being this bit of a harlot, although Samson doesn't come off well either because, you know, he's so foolish to fall, for her, you know, her rhetoric. Okay, so think about, if Delilah is a Scarlet Woman, is she any more scarlet than Rahab? Is she any more scarlet than Jal? And if so, why? Why is she the Scarlet Woman while the other two have songs sung about them? Okay. Now, one last thing, we are talking about the literature of the Bible, and so far what we've really looked at here is mythology, we've looked at laws, and we've looked at historical narratives, right? But what we also will see in the judges, right, is not only historical narratives, but heroes slash legends, right? Those kinds of tales, along with some mythology, although we're really more into legendary figures, but that Samson can kill 1,000 men with a single swipe of a jawbone. Yeah, it's kind of lapsing into mythology, right? We also see poems, we see riddles, we see songs, we see curses, and we see some folk tales. All right. So while we are focusing, on the narrative part, I also want you to notice that there's a lot of other, types of literary genres that are weaving themselves through these stories, right? And probably largely because the historians of the time, the Deuteronomist history, were trying to save some of these stories, save some of these riddles, save some of these curses, by textualizing them and putting them in to, this written form so that they would go on in history, right? Not only as the stories, but also as the art forms. Okay, so where you might be tempted to skip over some of these things, kind of take a look at them and figure out, like, what are they as a genre, and why are they inserting themselves here at this particular moment. Okay, so I hope that you have found this video useful as we continue to think about the historical narratives as well as the Scarlet Women of the Bible. Okay? All right. Have a good day.